Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Revenge songs can be a hard thing to write. It has to be specific enough to get your point across, but universal enough that other people can still relate to your pain. It's a difficult line to walk, and no song walks it quite like Carly Simon's You're So Vain. In it, she turns the very format of a revenge song on its head, calling out her intended target's behavior in excruciating detail, but then also calling them out for thinking they were even really the target. Over the years, Simon has dropped a handful of clues as to who the song is really about, but I'm not going to get into that here because honestly, I don't think that's the point. What makes this song great is that we all know someone it could have been about, so while knowing the answer is fine, I'm more interested in how she created the mystery in the first place. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this, with a fun little bass fill by Klaus Voormann to set the stage. Technically speaking, he's arpeggiating an A minor triad here, which you can hear a bit better if we slow it down. But the whole thing goes by so quickly that all you really get are these low A's on the beats and then a general sense of the chord as a whole. It's too fast to feel like an arpeggio, even though it is. This bass part doesn't really serve much of a musical function. It just outlines the one chord and it never repeats after the intro. It's not like a motif or anything. But it does serve a narrative function. It's a kind of sound painting using musical ideas to depict a scene. It's played in such a way that those low A's really punch through the rest of the chaos, giving an impression of powerful footsteps walking through a crowd, or in the context of the song, Simon walking up to an open microphone. From there the guitar comes in, also playing A minor, but the next real piece of sound painting comes from the piano, which does this, and then this, and then this. It's the same melody, but each time it gets lower and louder. The visuals here are a bit less literal, but if we follow the open mic story, this sounds like she's clearing her throat, letting the audience know she's ready to start and ramping up the intensity until they shut up and listen. It goes from, "Excuse me," to, "Is this thing on?" to, "Hey!" And once she's sure she has your attention, she goes right into the verse. Now, here we've got a bit of a mystery. We're mostly playing A minor with the occasional intrusion from F major. Normally, if I saw a move from A minor to F, I'd say it was a really smooth transition. They share a lot of notes in common, and they have similar functions in the key. But here, it doesn't feel smooth to me. It feels like an event, and there's a lot of reasons why. The most obvious is that it's the only change. We just came from the intro, which was entirely A minor, and then this part of the verse sits on that same chord for 3 out of its 4 bars. In such a monotonous setting, any new chord is going to feel like a surprise no matter how similar it is. But more important than that is the melody. Over the A minor chords, the highest note she sings is an E. He walked into the party, which she hits on beat 1 of each of the 3 bars. There's a sort of anchoring effect going on here. By repeatedly walking up to this E and then falling off it, she's making it clear that this is as high as the melody goes. That is, until the bar of F, walking onto a yacht, where she suddenly jumps up a perfect fourth to a high A. This lends some extra weight to whatever line she delivers here, which she uses to draw your attention to some unusual details. Like in the first verse, it emphasizes the line, "Your scarf, it was apricot," which on the surface feels irrelevant. Is the color of this dude's scarf really the most important thing you have to tell me about him? But by using this melodic emphasis, she reassures you that yes, this matters, which leads you to ask why she used such a specific color. She didn't say yellow or orange, she said apricot, implying that he's pretentious enough to know and care about that distinction. Of course, that's not the only valid reading here, but the point is that she's using the melody to tell you there's something worth reading into. She's highlighting the clues and leaving you to solve the mystery. The other thing I want to point out in the melody is its use of the note D. He walked into the party. This is what's called a tension, which means it's not a chord tone of A minor, but it sounds good over it anyway. It's less stable than a chord tone though. You can hang on a tension, but it feels weird to end on one. Leaning on D in the first half helps give us some forward momentum, even though the harmony's sitting still. It's clear we're going somewhere, and she resolves that tension by ending the line on E, a neighboring chord tone, to bring the melody to a satisfying conclusion. Walking onto a yacht. The use of tensions also gives the song a more complex, mature sound, which I think lends to its mysterious air. Tense melodic notes over stable harmony gives it an unsettled vibe that prompts you to wonder what's going on. And those tensions are in more than just the melody. I labeled these chords as triads, but in reality, Simon is playing all sorts of extra notes in her piano voicings. If we look closely at the first bar of A minor, we see that for half a beat, she plays a full-on G major chord. Or, well, Not really. It looks like the notes of G major, but the root is still A. She's just playing what's called an upper structure triad. It's a sort of pseudo-chord built from the higher, more complex notes that a chord has access to, including tensions. In this case, what looks like the root 3rd and 5th of a G major chord can also be read as the flat 7th, 9th, and 11th of A minor. These are some top-shelf notes, but the harmony is still the same. So why bother? Well, the G chord happens at the same time as that D in the melody, and momentarily leaning on the tensions in another instrument helps to more effectively sell that sound. We see a similar thing over the F chord, where she drops a C major, another upper structure triad, to add some flavor and support the melodic G. From there we move into the second half of the verse, and suddenly we've got a lot more chords to talk about. This sudden increase in harmonic rhythm separates this line from the rest of the verse, and looking through the lyrics, it seems to be where she places her main critique. The first half told us who this person was, and now she's telling us why they suck. The chords themselves are pretty straightforward. We start on F, the same flat 6 chord we heard in the first half. This familiar sound helps ease us into the new section. From there we basically do a walk-up resolution, going from flat 6 to flat 7 to 1 minor, except they interrupt it by sneaking in a 5 chord. This creates a slightly more interesting contour. Instead of a simple linear rise, we have this little feint in the other direction. It's there for decoration, and the rhythm makes that clear. The next chord, A minor, is anticipated, played an 8th note early to eat up some of the space that E chord was supposed to have. But I want to talk about that E chord because it's a little weird that it's minor. Usually, even in a minor key, if you go from 5 to 1, the 5 chord is major because it sounds more directional. Using a minor chord instead dulls that sense of resolution, further relegating this chord to the role of harmonic window dressing. But looking at the rest of the song, I think it also serves as a bit of foreshadowing. So far we've been playing in A minor, but the chorus is gonna pivot to C major. These two keys have what's called a relative relationship, which means they share all the same notes, they just use them differently. Or technically they almost have the same notes. Again, in A minor we'll usually play an E major chord even though it's not in the key, whereas in C there's no reason not to just play E minor. Hearing that version is kind of a signal of where we're going, a signal that gets reinforced by ending the progression on a C chord. It doesn't feel like home yet, but through some subtle harmonic gestures, we're starting to make that transition. By the time we reach the chorus, resolving to C will feel completely natural. Playing around with the boundaries between relative major and minor keys like this is actually a surprisingly common thing in pop and rock music, because it's a great way of creating interesting tonalities without using difficult chords. Everything you're hearing makes sense in the context you're hearing it in, it's just that context slowly shifts around without you ever really noticing. Before we get there though, we have to go through the pre-chorus, where we briefly hit G, then drop back down to F. This is where that transition really takes place. We've spent a lot of time with F as the flat 6 of A minor, but by sitting on it for so long and then going to C, it slowly morphs into that key's 4 chord. But it's not just sitting on it. This section is one of the most aggressive build-ups I've ever heard. It starts with a sudden drop down to soft piano and vocals, and then all the instruments come back in this massive crescendo ending like this. For reference, there's about a bar of music between those two clips. I probably could have played this whole thing without getting a copyright flag, but I think hearing them separate like that is honestly more interesting. It shows just how big this crescendo really is. That huge dynamic ramp builds up so much tension that you can't help but hear whatever comes next as a resolution, so when the chorus starts on C, our key change is complete. You can barely remember we were ever in A minor. So what's the chorus doing? Dude, come on. Seriously? That's so cool. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So we've got 2 bars of C, then a bar of some other chord, then another bar of C. Does that look at all familiar? It should. It's the same pattern as the verse, just with a relative major chord instead. But it doesn't stop there. In the verse, that other chord is F major, right? But in the chorus, it's D minor. Do you see where I'm going with this? Here, I'll give you a hint. If A is the relative minor of C, what's the relative minor of F? It's D. This is the exact same progression as the verse, but both chords have been swapped out for their relatives, inverting the tonality while maintaining the tone. Harmonically, it looks really different. We're going up a whole step instead of down a third, and D minor doesn't have the same function in the key that F did, but by doubling down on this relative relationship, we made something that still feels like it's the same thing, even though it doesn't sound like it. How cool is that? And the other thing I want to mention in this first part of the chorus is the melody.
You're so vain. You probably think this song is about you.
It's pretty low, right? I mean, the verse mostly floated around D and E, but in the chorus it's G and A, a perfect fifth down. The chorus is supposed to be the energetic climax of the song, and that normally means it's got the highest melody, and while she does bring it up a bit later on, she ultimately tops out at the same A she did in the verse.
I'll bet you think this song is about you.
But it's not like the section isn't energetic. Again, we just talked about the build-up in the pre-chorus. This is the payoff, so where's the vocal energy? I think the reason it's missing is to help convey the song's sarcastic sense of bitterness. She's not shoving her anger in her target's face, she's reveling in his inability to tell for sure if he's even the one she's mad at. It's revenge, sure, but it's calm, cool, and collected. She's not going for something as simple as just calling him out. She wants to leave him with a little voice in the back of his head that will forever wonder if maybe, just maybe, the song really is about him. This moment isn't supposed to be an explosion. It's a slow burn that'll last for years, and undercutting the energetic eruption with a confidently low vocal delivery gives that fire just a little bit more fuel. This brings us to the second half, where we start to work our way back to A minor. If we include the C from the bar before this, we're going 1, 6, 4, 5. This is a really common progression in popular music, often called the doo-wop changes, but they've shifted its position a bit so that the phrase starts on the 6 chord. Much like the C in the verse, this doesn't feel like home yet, but the more prominent metric position is priming you to hear it that way later. This is especially effective because without the C, this whole thing looks like it's setting up that same walk-up resolution we heard in the back half of the verse, with 1 minor, then flat 6, flat 7, then presumably back to 1. And to really sell the transition, they end by hanging on that G chord. Again, this creates a desire to hear the next chord as a resolution, no matter what it is, and while they can't do a big dynamic build-up this time, they do punctuate it with some syncopated stabs.
Don't you, don't you, don't you, oh, yeah.
Which again creates some non-harmonic tension so that when it melts back to A minor, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. And that's pretty much it. The rest of the song is basically just that 3 more times and then a fade out on the first half of the chorus. Over the years, Simon has dropped hints about the identity of the song's subject, eventually revealing that the 3 verses are about 3 different men, and this simple repeating form without a bridge or other musical interlude helps tie the stories of those 3 men together. The parallels between them are highlighted not just in the lyrics, but in the form itself. By sticking to such a strong narrative, Simon's story manages to be both deeply personal and almost universally relatable, creating a mystery so intriguing that almost 50 years later, people still aren't sure who exactly the song is really about. And hey, thanks for watching. As always, the song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. And because this is YouTube, I have to ask you to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.